Thank you, Uli, and thanks everybody for being here. It's a pleasure always to be in Bellingham. I think maybe this is the 8th time I've been part of International Week here, and so I'm delighted. Some of you are the same students that were here 8 years ago, so don't worry about that graduation thing, you know, that degree. Just stay, keep learning. Our mission today is a good one because it's going to dance across the surface of 5 different countries or 4 countries and an occupied territory. And all of them are worthy of 90 minutes that we could spend together, each of them in its own right. But we're not going to do that. We're going to try to cover them all to give you a sense of a couple of things. One of them is the things they have in common, and the things they have in common that work for them, and the things they have in common that are a burden to them. We'll talk more about that. But the other reason is that it's such a central part of our news feeds these days. You're going to discover that you, I hope, at the end of our time together, you'll know more about Syria and Turkey and Lebanon, Palestine and Israel than you did when you first walked in. And theoretically, that's going to mean that you'll be able to digest the news better than you were before. So our job is to just give you a little bit more background information. We've all seen the headlines coming from the Middle East for a long time, but what I'm hoping to do is give you a little bit of the story below the headlines. So we'll have plenty of material to cover in a relatively short period of time. If you get motion sickness from how fast we're going, Uli has some Dramamine that he can give, or the cookies do the same thing. Make sure you eat up when you can. So our impossible mission is going to be to thank you for being here, and thank Whatcom Community College for having me again. Thank Uli and Kelly and everybody in the International Office and all of the faculty members who are here today. We're going to look at the Ottoman Empire, something you may not have spent a whole lot of time thinking about, but it was an absolutely significant and feeder phenomenon into the 26 countries in the Middle East that grew out of that Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. We could spend all day or all semester on that, but we're not going to. We're going to look at Turkey. They've changed the spelling of their name, but not necessarily the pronunciation, Turkiye. Then Syria, then Lebanon, and then we'll dive into Israel and Palestine. Again, something we could spend all day on, but won't. But the mission here is for you to get some information and to have an opportunity to call out and say, but what about this, that, or the other? So a very important part of this is your own questions and comments about what we are covering. Finally, and if you've been to one of my talks before, you know that we always have a benediction. Benediction comes from the Latin good word. So what I'm hoping to do is leave you with a good word about this territory on our planet, so that you don't necessarily go away thinking, woe is me, this is depressing. So the hope is that there is, in fact, some hope at the end of the day. One of the things that I forgot to distribute to you is your resource list. The reading list is really designed for you to take a deeper dive into any one of these topics, and because we don't have time to cover them all in depth, I wanted to make sure that you had a good listing of really absolutely spectacular resources. Somebody once said that he read all these books so that you don't have to, and I have read all these books, but I do want you to too, particularly if you get any interest in the region. You can also delve into both the print and online resources that are listed in your resource list. That's absolutely a crucial part of today. Hopefully today will just be a kind of a springboard into this region that also has changed its name in scholarly circles. We used to call it MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, as you can see there. But nowadays, it's called SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa. And the reason they changed the name in scholarly circles is that Middle East referred to a kind of a colonial past. The Middle East was partway between Britain and India. So it was the Middle East, but only to the British. And so they were trying to decolonize the term and give it its own absolutely neutral geographic term, Southwest Asia. And that usually includes all of this territory over here. Maybe also including Egypt, but Egypt spans both, is part of both North Africa and Southwest Asia. What you'll see in the next slide is a remarkable arrow. And as Uli said, this is where I lived for 6 years of my adult life in Oman, and I was able to get an appreciation for not only the people and the culture and a sense of Islam as a religion, but also a good deal of Arabic language training, as you can imagine, in 6 years. But it also allowed me to travel all the way around the Middle East, all the way to Morocco on the western side of North Africa. So my perspective comes from having lived in this part of the world for what seems like now quite a long period of time. It was 2-3 year stints at a time. As Uli mentioned, the Levant is called the Levant because it comes from the French word lever, to rise, or se lever, to raise. I've got those backwards. Lever, to raise, and se lever, to rise. And this is the present participle, rising. Why do you suppose they called it that? The sun comes up there. Right? The sun rises in the east. If you were part of the Roman Empire, let's go back a slide or two. All of this Mediterranean Sea was part of the Roman Empire, part of many empires over the years, but this was the part where the sun came up. And so it got the name Levant. Later on, when the French developed out of Latin, they put their own stamp on it. Here's that Ottoman Empire that I mentioned, and how expansive and extensive it was all the way up to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. They had an extraordinary amount of control over all of these territories that are highlighted in both orange and yellow, and it was a very significant part of both European and North African and Asian history. But it also was the kind of center for a tremendous amount of scholarship and architecture, arts and culture, politics, and it sort of ebbed and flowed over the centuries, but it lasted almost 600 years, controlling all of this part of Southeast Europe. So Bulgaria, Romania, the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, all the way up into and up to almost the gates of Vienna in what is today Austria. They also had an extraordinary number of two things, strong leaders, sultans they were called, or sultans, and this is a artist's rendition of Osman, who it was the first and the founder of the Ottoman Empire, Osman being the name that was slightly mischaracterized as Ottoman when it got into the English language. So the empire's name is after the founder, in fact, Osman I. You'll notice something else about the four sultans that I mentioned. Mehmet II was the conqueror because he's the one who finally conquered the Byzantine Empire in 1553. 1453, sorry. Selim I, why do you suppose they called him the Grim? I mean, he always looked like this, apparently. No matter what happened in his life, he had this sour look upon his face. And all the people in his empire simply referred to him as the Grim. And the last person, probably the greatest of all the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, was Suleiman the Magnificent. But also, you may have noticed something else about these four sultans. What was it? Their hats, for goodness sakes. They had the greatest headwear of any empire ever. And headwear, what you put on your head, plays a part of Turkish today history going all the way back to the 13th century. But the sultans got to wear these increasingly large and seemingly inflated headdresses all the way up to the point where some reforms started to take place. And they said, no more of these fancy turbans, we're all going to wear a fez. You've seen fezes, small little hats that sit on top of men's heads. And then another leader in Turkey comes along and says, no more fezes, we're all going to wear Western hats. You're going to see all of this happening before your eyes in the next few minutes. World War I is the end of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, it's the end of most land-based empires. There was a German empire, an Austro-Hungarian empire, a Russian empire, and they all fall apart at the end of World War I. In World War II, most of the maritime empires fall apart. But at the end of World War I, when war broke out in 1914, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans all joined forces as the kind of central powers, as they were called, but they were all clearly picking the wrong side. Opposing them were Britain on the top left, France in the middle, and then the Russian Empire as well. And sort of in a kind of Johnny-come-lately way, in 1917, the United States joined the Allies, France and Britain and Russia, to defeat the Central Powers. This is all going to play a role in what we talk about today when we get to all of these countries that were formed out of the Ottoman Empire and how they were formed. The British and the French, who were clearly controlling that part of the world, had an idea very early in the First World War that A, they were going to win, and B, that they were going to have to carve up the Ottoman Empire some way. And they thought, well, maybe we could give each of these ethnic groups their own country. And then they thought, no, a better idea is France, you take half, Britain will take half. So they, in fact, carved up the Ottoman Empire pretty much 50-50. And the two guys that were in charge of that process were Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot. This was their idea of what to do with the Levant. Better picture of it here. So they decided to draw a line across the middle of the Ottoman Empire's territory in the Levant, and the French would take the top half, and the British would take the bottom half. The Americans had a different set of ideas, but their ideas coincided with a devastating stroke that Woodrow Wilson suffered in 1919, and the United States pulled out of the world virtually entirely, leaving the British and the French to do what they wanted in the Levant. Turkey, the sort of, what's the right word, mothership of the Ottoman Empire, because of Istanbul there in the top left, Turkey forms its own polity, its own political enterprise and structure. At the end of the First World War, by the 1920s, they had declared a republic. And they declared that republic not under a sultan or a caliph, but a president, in fact. And that was a kind of a famous war hero from World War I, who defeated the British and the French at Gallipoli, a battle you may have heard about. And his name was Mustafa Kemal. And the Turkish people gave him an honorific name, Ataturk, father of the Turks, and this is how we refer to him today. Interestingly, he was quite different from Turks that you might have expected him to be. He was blonde, he had blue eyes, and he was born in what is today Greece. So the father of the Turks was in fact a part of the farther flung Ottoman Empire than just the people on the Anatolian Peninsula. I mentioned that he had an impact on what you wear on your head in the Turkish Republic, and he said no more fezzes, no more turbans, everybody's going to, all the men are going to wear these British hats. This should give you a sense of two things. One, where his sort of aesthetic values lay, and also that he wanted there to be a kind of a daily reminder for everybody that he was in charge. And every time you saw a man in one of these British hats, you knew it was because of Ataturk. It was a kind of an interesting power demonstration, maybe that other countries will have tried to use in other places around the world. One of the first questions that you're all wondering is, why do we call this bird a turkey? And I know you're just dying to ask that question, so I wonder if somebody doesn't want to ask that question. Yeah, you do. Don't you want to know? No, she doesn't really want to know. Who wants to know? Yeah.
Why is it a turkey?
Why do we call this a turkey? Well, isn't that an interesting question? So we call this a turkey because it was misidentified as a bird that those Europeans who colonized the United States eastern seaboard got to the United States in the 17th century and saw this indigenous bird and said, oh, that's a turkey. Well, what they thought they were seeing was, in fact, this, which was called a guinea fowl back in the day. And the guinea fowl was a bird that was transported and exported into Europe from Asia and from Africa by the British as a guinea fowl. And so the British had agents that they, at the end of the 16th century, put in place in Istanbul. These are British guys, right, dressed up as Turks, and it was their job to take these guinea fowl up on the right and export them into the rest of Europe. Well, those guinea fowl started to be called turkey cocks or turkey hens because they were all coming through Istanbul, and then it was those early settlers in the United States who mistook that bird for this bird, and that's why we call them turkeys. So it really does come from Turkey, but only the name and only through a mistake. Turkey today is a populous country, mostly on the Anatolian Peninsula and a little bit in southeastern Europe, and lots of people, and pretty well developed in an industrial sense compared to lots of the countries around it, predominantly Muslim, but they have a real interesting demographic mix, and part of that mix are the Kurds. You've probably heard about the Kurds as people who are also fighting in virtually every part of this territory for their own national independence. We'll talk about that in a minute. Turkey also has nearly 5 million Syrians who have fled the Syrian civil war in the last 15 years up into Turkey. 5 million already in Turkey from Syria. The hope is that with things improving in Syria, that those Syrians will go back. Turkey's also curiously been a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, even though it's nowhere near the North Atlantic. And it has been part of that since the early 1950s. It played a role in all sorts of things, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. We could talk about that if we had time. They became independent in 1923, and as I said, it was the center of the Ottoman Empire for nearly 6 centuries. The capital city of Istanbul was known originally as Byzantium, and then to Constantinople when it was under the Byzantine Empire, named after the Emperor Constantine from the Roman Empire, and then changed in the 15th century to Istanbul. There's a lot of question about where the name Istanbul comes from, and the most frequently accepted answer to that question is that the locals tried to pronounce Constantinople and it came out Istanbul. True story. Maybe true. But I mentioned the Kurds, and I mentioned the First World War, and I mentioned the British and the French carving it up, but there were other people, particularly before Woodrow Wilson's stroke, who wanted to have a different outcome. And so they thought about giving Syria to either the United States or the UK, giving Mesopotamia, where all the oil and all the water is, to either the US or the UK, letting the French do virtually nothing, because there was a sense at the end of the First World War that the French hadn't really contributed as much as they should have. And look what the American Commission, the King Crane Commission, had in mind for Kurdistan. Well, Kurdistan, of course, never is created at the end of the First World War. And to this day, the Kurds are spread across 5 different countries in this part of the world. Iran on this side, Iraq here, northern Syria, the majority of them are in Turkey, even up into Armenia are there Turkish enclaves. The current president of Iran, in fact, is half Kurdish and half Azerbaijani. He isn't Persian at all. The Kurds present a real alphabet soup of freedom fighter organizations. The PKK is the one inside the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey. The PYD and the YPG are also in the same region, but in Syria and in Iraq. Interestingly, all these are Kurds, but they don't necessarily get along with each other, which it could stand in the way of them creating enough of a groundswell for the creation of their own nation. But they are probably the largest population of ethnically homogeneous people in the world that don't have their own country. The second largest group is probably the Palestinians. We'll get to them. Strongman leadership was the rule in the Ottoman Empire. It was the rule when it became a republic under Ataturk in the 1920s and 30s, and continues to this day under the strongman rule in the case currently of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Erdogan came aboard and grew up in Turkish political scene in the 1990s when he became the mayor of Istanbul. And he did so in conjunction with a religious partner, Fethullah Gulen. The two of them sort of decided that they had had enough of Ataturk's idea that the mosque and the state should be separated. Ataturk was unswervingly opposed to having there be an Islamic state in Turkey. And Erdogan is just as unswervingly interested in having Islam be incorporated into the Turkish government today. He used, with the help of a religious scholar, Fethullah Gulen, to gain power. And as soon as he did, of course, with the support of the Muslim Brotherhood, we can talk more about them, time permitting, becomes the mayor. But then he gets arrested. The mayor of Istanbul does, and put in prison. And the reason that he got arrested was he read a poem out loud. And you're going to hear a line from that poem in just a second. But he violated the Ataturkian concept of a secular state, meaning not a religious state. And they imprisoned the mayor of their own largest city almost for 2 years. He gets out of the prison, but is banned from running for any public office because of his convicted felon status. So when he finally gets strong enough politically, he runs for office, and his party changes the Constitution. Watch out for strong men that want to change constitutions. The poem he read is this. This is English translation. The mosques are our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets our bayonets, and the faithful our soldiers. Nothing could be less Ataturkian than this poem, and he clearly violated the rules of the game. His party eventually develops into something called the Justice and Development Party, AKP, and has this marvelous modernizing logo, but with a spiked helmet around the outside. And essentially it means stick with us for development, but don't toy with the government. We'll be in charge. 2003, he becomes prime minister, changes the constitution again, and eventually becomes president. He has a falling out with Fethullah Gulen, who leaves for Pennsylvania. Erdogan blames him for all manner and means of problems in Turkey for the next almost 20 years before Gulen died last year. One of the aspects of Erdogan's rule in Turkey is, I'm sorry to do this to you before lunch, but one of the aspects of his approach to his country is that he slices away your political and civil rights piece by tiny piece so that you don't notice. This doner kebab image is often used in Turkey to illustrate his rule. One after another, political parties are marginalized. One after another, critical journalists are imprisoned. There are the two countries with the most journalists in prison in the world are, number one, does anybody know? China. And number two, Turkey. Yeah, think about that. But he also said famously this, that democracy is like a bus. You take it as far as you want it, it's of use to you, and then you get off. And so his vision for running Turkey is clearly as a strong man running his own territory. Freedom House says, oh, the coup, we could talk about the coup. The army in Turkey is generally thought to be the guardrail against dictatorship. And there was a coup in 2016 and was quickly put down. And after that, Erdogan became even more authoritarian, blaming and purging the government of all his perceived critics and Gulenists. And Freedom House gave them a not free rating. 33 out of 100 was how they did in 2024. What do you think Norway's score is? It used to be 100 and now it's 98. I think they've slipped a little bit. What do you think the United States score is?
Lower than 30.
Yeah, no, not quite. It's 83 for 2024. We're continuing to try to make a more perfect union. What do you think Saudi Arabia's is? 9. Turkey has played a role in the overthrow of the Assad government just to the south in Syria, and we're going to talk a good deal about that right now. But critically, the Turks were supportive of the resistance movement to Assad's government up here in Idlib province. You've heard a lot about Idlib province. Lots of interaction with the Turks, both militarily and economically and politically during that period. And then the resistance movements sort of burst out of Idlib province and in 11 days overthrow the Assad regime. Let's talk about Syria. One of the things that typifies almost every country in the Middle East, except for Turkey, because it was its own empire, is how much other empires influenced their development. So Syria has an absolutely textbook case of being part of an empire, then a colony, and then a very short period of time when they had a sort of development and democracy and a free market in mind, and then quickly fell into dictatorship. That dictatorship under two men, Hafez and Bashar al-Assad, lasted 55 years under the same government. Until the Arab Spring that started the civil war in 2011, and the civil war quickly devolved into a Cold War and a Holy War, a proxy war. We'll talk about that too. The refugees fled in large numbers from Syria, as many as half of the population of about 23 million people were either displaced internally or left the country altogether. Many, as we saw, to Turkey and to Lebanon and to Jordan mostly. The amount of outside interference in this part of the world is just uncanny. I'll show you a slide that you will scratch your heads over. And by the way, I'll also send all of these slides to Uli, and he can then distribute them to anybody who wants them. The Assad regime falls, and something called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham takes over the resistance, the strongest unit in Syria fighting against Assad, and manages to, in fact, replace that government in a very short period of time. But as I said, there are distinct periods in Middle East history for virtually every one of these countries. They're part of somebody's empire, then they become a colony, and then they get independence, and for a brief shining moment, they are trying to develop and become modern states, and quickly, there's either a coup d'etat, some general or some colonel or some sergeant takes over, or the monarchy returns, or they get subsumed by somebody else's security state, and they don't ever have time to develop their own sense of who they are and what the rules of the game should be inside their country. And this leads me to this daguerreotype, this old ancient photograph from 1845. Who do you think these 9 seated figures are? This is in the United States. 9 should ring a bell. It's the Supreme Court of 1845. Okay, now, jumping off from this suggested wonderful answer over here, just practice a number right now. Everybody say 5. 5. Everybody, boldly. 5. 5. Good. 3. 3. Okay, just think about numbers between 1 and 9. Now, of these 9 seated figures, here's your chance. How many of them are men?
9.
Good. Try it again. How many of them are men?
9.
Good. And how many of them are white?
9.
And how many of them are Protestant?
9.
Yes, you've got it right. So in 1845, this is what our Supreme Court looked like. You will all know that our Supreme Court now looks like this. And while I don't always agree with their positions on all legal issues, look at the diversity in this court. How many women are there on the court? 4. How many African Americans are there? Good. How many Catholics are there? 6. And how many vegans are there?
1.
Yeah, good, good. But look at it. Back in 1845, it was illegal to teach him how to read or her how to read. Women couldn't get into a law school. Jews couldn't get into a law school. Hispanics couldn't get into a law school. Where is she there? And we really have come a long way. Even though I, again, disagree often with them, we had a chance to become a more perfect union in ways that almost every country in the Middle East has not had a chance to do that.
Who's the vegan?
The vegan, actually, I cheated on the vegan. It was Justice Breyer before he retired. But he didn't retire to McDonald's. He's still a vegan, but he's no longer on the court. So all of these countries don't have a chance to do that. They instead get corralled into some strong man's, always a man, sorry to say, idea of what the state should be like. They don't determine it themselves. They're told what it is. And so they don't have any chance to define any of these basic concepts. All of these basic concepts are things that we have struggled with and put our oar in the water and rowed furiously about. Who's a citizen? What the government should be like? What are the limitations of government? What are the obligations of citizens? Virtually no country in the Middle East has had this opportunity. Syria is a classic case of it. They had just one generation between independence in 1946, and when Hafez al-Assad took over the government in 1970. So help me with the math, 24 years they had to sort of try to work all of those huge issues out and never did have a chance to do it. They also were a country of extraordinary diversity. The Kurds, as I said, were up in the northeast. The Alawites, which are a kind of an offshoot Shiite Islamic sect that the Ottoman Empire didn't consider to be Islamic. All sorts of other people all around the country, including the Druze. You may have heard about the Druze down in the south, and also its own offshoot from Islam, but a different religion. The Hafez al-Assad family takes over in 1970, and it's these two guys in particular, first the father, and then the son, and they lasted for all of those years. And one of the reasons that they did take over was that the French really liked them. The French picked out a minority and then privileged them. So they got the best education, they got roles in the military, they rose up in the governmental structure, but they were a decided minority in Syria and ran the country for 55 years. These minorities that get privileged by the imperial powers are in virtually every one of these countries. The Arab Spring starts to bubble out of the frustration of Arab youth mostly, and then massive population movements in December of 2010, starts in Tunisia, and then like a wildfire crosses all the way through the Muslim world, across North Africa and Southwest Asia, and has a manifestation in Syria. This graffiti was written on the side of a wall of a middle school in Daraa in southern Syria. It says, Ijak edur ya daktur. Let's try it. Ijak edur ya daktur. Well, Bashar al-Assad, you probably know, is a trained ophthalmologist. So they refer to him as the doctor. And this says, once the Arab Spring has started, your time is coming, doctor. And the students who apparently scribbled this on the wall of their middle school were arrested, tortured, eventually released about 6 months later. These are kids 14, 15, 16 years old, and that was the start of the Arab Spring in Syria that lasted for 14 years before Bashar al-Assad was finally removed from office. As I mentioned, there were all sorts of different groups active in Syria at this point, and you'd think, well, this is a mess, that there are all these different groups that have tried to assert their authority and assert their dominance over the other groups. The Turkmen, the Syrian government, the Islamic State, Nusra Front, the Free Syrian Army, the Kurds up in the north, and you would have thought, this is a catastrophe. They'll never be able to get together in one country and form a more perfect union the way that we had the opportunity to. And unfortunately, it gets worse, because the whole rest of the world wants to also influence what's going on in this part of the Middle East. And this is what the next slide looks like. Oh, a guy from the past. He says this in his 14 points. The Turkish portion of the present Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty, but the other nationalities, like Syria, which are now under Ottoman rule, should be assured an undoubted security of life and an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. This is Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, saying that these constituent parts of the Ottoman Empire should have an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. And yet in Syria, the slide looks like this. You could spend a semester looking at all of the different aspects of the interference from all of these outside players in the Syrian civil war. It's the farthest thing from completely unmolested. This is a famous painting of the souk in Damascus. Souk is the market, the open market, the traditional market in many Muslim majority countries. And Bashar al-Assad's response to the Arab Spring was pretty much to drop barrel bombs on everybody. And so he bombed his own country for years and years and years and years, used chemical weapons against his own people for years and years and years and years, and finally invited in the Russians in 2015 to help him bomb his people for more years and years and years and years. So the Damascus Gate that looked like this in 1890 now looks like this. Aleppo looks like this. Aleppo was the largest city in Syria. And again, this is the result of your own government bombing your own major commercial hub of your country. The refugees are fleeing in every direction possible to try to escape the death and destruction. A lot of them go across the Mediterranean if they can, and then in very leaky boats up into Europe. That was something that sort of caused a tsunami of a political change in Europe in 2015 and continues to this day. This is a good image of many of those Syrians trying to escape from Syria across the Mediterranean or walking across the desert and getting up into Turkey and then through Turkey getting to another leaking boat and trying to get in Europe, into Europe through Greece. I mentioned those refugees because they are critical components of this whole story, but they're not the whole story, and that is when we get to this. There are other people who have Syrian roots. You probably know this already, but Steve Jobs' father was named Abdel Fattah el-Jandali, and he was from Syria, Muslim, went to the University of Wisconsin, fell in love with an American woman. She becomes pregnant. He goes to her father and says, I'd like to marry your daughter. The father says, no, my daughter of mine is going to marry a Muslim. And they separate the two. The wife gives birth, the woman gives birth to a baby boy, and the Jobs family comes and picks him up and adopts him. So without Syrian refugees of one stripe or another, we wouldn't have the laptop that I made this PowerPoint on. And here's another Syrian American, in fact, Jerry Seinfeld. Some of you are probably not old enough to remember this television show, but watch it on YouTube. Jerry Seinfeld, two of his grandparents were from Aleppo. So in 1915, two of his four grandparents emigrated from Syria and came to New York City and started their lives there. So without Syrian immigrants, we wouldn't have laptops, we wouldn't have Apple products, and we wouldn't be funny in any way. So I mention that because of this criticality of Syria, even in our own distant land and culture. The group that takes over in Idlib province is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the movement for the liberation of the Levant. And the head of that group is a man whose name is Ahmed Shara. And the question is going to be whether or not he can hold this very disparate collection of populations, ethnicities, religious outlooks of Syria together in the new era. The jury is still out on Ahmed Shara. Next door to Syria, of course, is Lebanon, that you've heard so much about over the years. We're going to look at their demography. Their colonial period looked very much like Syria's. The government structure is peculiar. The economy is in dire straits. They've been fighting a civil war on and off with Israel since the founding of Israel in 1948. Hezbollah, Shiite, Iran-supported resistance movement starts in the 1980s and becomes a huge both military force and political force in the country, and then we'll look at Lebanon today. Lebanon's not a very large country, and it's tucked right into the very Levant of the Levant, right on the coast of the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And it is an extraordinary tapestry. If you wanted religious diversity in your country, you would model it after Lebanon. This is what it looks like. The Muslim majority, the Muslim population is the majority today, but this is what Lebanon looks like on a religious basis. Again, when you get these slides, you'll see that there are the Shiites and the Sunnis and the Catholics and the Druze and virtually everybody imaginable, all put into this one country whose boundaries were drawn by Lebanese? No, drawn by the French, of course, as part of the mandate after the First World War. This is an extraordinary collection of peoples and beliefs, and it's based on the last census that the French did nearly 100 years ago, where back in those days, according to the French, the majority of people in Lebanon were in fact Christian. But the odds of that's still true are so slim that 2025 has got a completely different demographic picture in Lebanon. And the reason that the government is still structured along lines as if the Christians were still in the majority is that in 1943, when Lebanon became independent, they entered into something called the National Pact. And the National Pact was an agreement with the blessing of the French that the majority of Maronite Christians, Catholics, this is an image, an icon of Saint Maron at the beginning of the 5th century of the Common Era. The Druze have a part in it, the Maronites have a part in it, the Sunni Shiites and the Sunni and the Shiites do. And today, the structure of the government is that the president must be a Christian, just elected, Joseph Aoun. The prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim. The leader of the parliament must be a Shia Muslim. The head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff must be a Druze. And so all of the important roles in the government of Lebanon are determined by your religious affiliation. It's not a recipe for success. Aoun is a well-respected general in the Lebanese army. A lot of people are hopeful that he'll be able to carry forward. As you probably remember from your news cycle 5 years ago, they suffered from a tremendous explosion in the port of Beirut when a terminal, a warehouse exploded that was full of 75,000 tons of ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is the same explosive that Timothy McVeigh used to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma City. It is an extremely volatile substance. And guess who controlled the warehouse? Hezbollah, the Shiite resistance movement, was in control of the warehouse. The fire starts in the warehouse. Apparently, the fire department and the usual governmental response teams were kept away from it by Hezbollah, and this is what it looked like in the next few seconds. The largest non-nuclear blast ever on the planet Earth. Hundreds of people were killed, hundreds of buildings were destroyed, and they're still suffering an extraordinary devastation of their economy as a result. Nawaf Salam comes in just last week as the Prime Minister of Lebanon, apparently a very thoughtful, well-educated guy. He has a degree from Harvard Law School. There's hope for Nawaf Salam that he may be able to hold the country together along with Joseph Aoun and also Nabi Berri. Hezbollah, the resistance group, starts in 1982 with the first long-term invasion of Lebanon by Israel. Their leader for years and years and years was a man named Hassan Nasrallah, and he was assassinated by the Israelis last year. The whole question that is in the news today is what to do with this southern part of Lebanon, south of the Litani River, and the current ceasefire between and among all the parties in the war between Israel and Lebanon is that the Hezbollah is supposed to withdraw all of its forces north of the Litani River, and Israel is supposed to withdraw all of its forces back into Israel south of the Litani River. You'll notice a line here that's called the blue line. What do you think that is?
It's like a river.
Not a second river, but a border in quotes. The border between Lebanon and Israel has never been defined. And so you're going to fight over this territory in southern Lebanon, and you're going to say, well, this part happens to be mine. Oh, no, that part is mine. That part over there is mine. And no, that's yours. No, that's mine. They're still fighting over that border that has never been internationally sanctioned. Again, not a recipe for success. Okay, what you've all been waiting for, but I wanted to give you Turkey and Syria and Lebanon as a kind of a background for what the neighborhood looks like around Israel and Palestine. And this is a pretty good way, I think, to try to understand what's happening in this benighted part of the world. But before we get started, I have noticed that this is a kind of an emotional topic for a lot of people. They're either emotionally pro-Israel or emotionally pro-Palestine, And so I recognize that you can be emotionally committed to either side or the other, but what I want to encourage us all to do is the following. Let's be rational in our discourse, respectful in our inquiry, and civil in our exchanges, because we are not going to agree about any of this stuff. And also, I think it's important for each of us to recognize that we probably have a bias. And I do too. My bias happens to be a kind of Solomonic, let's just divide it in half bias. I think that both Israel and the Palestinians have a legitimate claim to a part of this territory. But neither group has a legitimate claim to all of it. That's my bias, and you'll see it come out. But I have sympathies with both sides and also criticism of both sides. What do you think the answer to this question is? Well, as a kind of an armchair historian, I decided to go back in history to see who fired the first shot, who fired the first arrow, who slung the first stone. And as you can imagine, with that last image, I got back to this. So according to biblical records, written by one side, I might add, that David and Goliath met on a plain between Judea and Philistia, where the Philistines, where the Palestinians were, and the Israelites were, and they had this epic battle where David defeats Goliath. That was, at least according to biblical records, 3,000 years ago. So if you wonder who started it, you have to go way back into the past to try to figure out what the roots of this conflict are. To help you do that, I've put 3 books in particular up at the front of the hall. One by Ari Shavit about Israel, written by an Israeli. One about called the Iron Cage, written by a Palestinian American, about Palestine. And the one in the middle, a wonderful book by a French political scientist named Jean-Pierre Filiu, called Gaza. And if you wondered anything about Gaza over the last 14 or 15 months, this is a fantastic book to read. Was written about 12 years ago, and he goes all the way back in history for the historical antecedents of the peoples who lived there, the trade that went through there, and the conflicts that have happened ever since Gaza existed. One of the things that happens about 2,000 years ago, as you all probably know, is that the Romans conquer Palestine and force the Jews out. And this was really the beginning of the first major diaspora of the Jewish people, who were forced out of historic parts of Israel, Judea, Samaria, and went all around the world, eventually even to the Americas and to Asia, to the east. But this was the beginning of the scattering of the Jewish people, forced out by one of those imperial powers, in this case the Romans. But it didn't end in 70 AD with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem by the Romans. It continued for 20 centuries, where the Jews were continuously forced out of countries everywhere they went. One of the slides that you'll get when Uli sends them your way is this one. Virtually every European country expelled the Jews at one time or another, and in many cases, permanently. There was no safe place for the Jews who had escaped the Romans, emigrated into Europe, only to be expelled again or ethnically cleansed. One of the great ethnic cleansers was the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, Catherine II, and she decided that the Jews there were too many of them and they were all over everywhere, so let's concentrate them in what the Russians called the Pale of Settlement. So Jews were forcibly displaced from all sorts of territories on either side of this territory in Tsarist Russia and forced into these areas. Their occupations were limited, their education, formal education was limited, their movement was limited. Yeah.
Is this where Fiddler on the Roof comes from?
It's so funny you should ask that. Hold that thought. Is this where Fiddler on the Roof comes from? The Pale of Settlement has a pretty high concentration of Jews all throughout what is today Ukraine down here and all the way up into Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Belarus, and one of the most famous of those people, of course, is Tevye. Yeah. Tevye, the milkman in Shalom Aleichem stories, called Tevye, the milkman, but where we get Fiddler on the Roof stories. And that the village of Anatevka, which was fictional, was probably right about here. It said it was about 3 days horse ride from Kyiv. Alexander II, great grandson of Catherine II, does a pretty good job by the Jews, actually, allows them in many cases to be freed from their serfdom, but then Alexander the Great is assassinated in 1881, and his son, Alexander III, blames the Jews, right? It must have been the Jews that killed Alexander II, and then unleashing a whole series of pogroms that were designed to either force the Jews out of this territory or simply kill them. So this is the European context for what is going to lead up to finally the creation of some place, hopefully safe and secure, in Palestine. It takes quite a bit of advocacy for that to happen. Theodor Herzl comes up with the idea that maybe there should be a Jewish state because we're not safe in Britain or France or Germany or Poland or Belarus or Russia. We've got to have some place where we can be safe. And a whole series of very influential European Jews get involved in the process of trying to help create the state of Israel. Chaim Weizmann was the first president of Israel, David Ben-Gurion the first prime minister of Israel. A young woman named Golda Meir was a very active advocate in the 20s and 30s, and she, of course, becomes prime minister herself in the 1970s. After the Second World War, of course, we also learned that the devastation of the Jewish population in Europe wasn't just all of those expulsions and ethnic cleansings, but was also the horrifying experience of Jews under the control of the Nazi regime in Germany. Against this background, people started thinking about Woodrow Wilson, and about Woodrow Wilson saying, you know, a people, meaning a culturally and sometimes ethnically homogeneous group, really deserves their own state. This was an idea at the beginning of the 20th century that led to so many countries gaining their independence from those imperial forces. And people start to remember what Wilson said. But all the while, the British and the French are trying to sort of maneuver their way into controlling the Levant, and so they promise the Arabs that they can have territory if they fight for it against the Turks. They send a guy named Lawrence into Arabia to help promote that activity, a rebellion against the Turks. Sykes and Picot divvy up the map and say, well, no, we'll take this part and we'll take that part. And then along comes Lord Balfour. He's got to be the grandfather of John Cleese. If he isn't, there's something wrong with the world. But he decides that he's not only going to promise the Arabs the territory if they fight for it, but he's going to promise the Jews the territory if they fight for it. And he comes up with this thing called the Balfour Declaration now. You're looking at 100% of the Balfour Declaration, where he says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So he's just promised the Arabs this territory if they can fight and liberate it. He's now made the commitment of Great Britain, the largest power on earth, to giving it to the Jews for a national homeland, and they keep promising the same territory to other people to try to figure out a way to win the First World War. It was bad, but as Jack Straw said, a later foreign secretary, said in 2002, a lot of the problems we are having to deal with now, I have to deal with now, are a consequence of our colonial past. The Balfour Declaration and the contradictory assurances which were being given to the Palestinians in private at the same time that they were being given to the Israelis, again, an interesting history for us, but not an honorable one. The British promised the Italians they could keep North Africa. The British promised the Russians that they could have Istanbul. The British promised the Arabs independence. The British promised the Jews a national home in Palestine. The British promised the French half of the Ottoman territory. They promised themselves the other half. And finally, they promised the US that you could have a say in how the post-war Ottoman Empire should be carved up. But with Woodrow Wilson's stroke, the United States becomes a non-player in that whole period in the 1920s. The British take on the mandate for Palestine, what they call Mandatory Palestine, and it is a majority Muslim, minority Jewish, minority Christian territory from a 1922 census. It looks like this in 1917. Palestinian territory and Jewish-owned territory in the blue, very minority Jewish. And then the United States gets back onto its feet after the end of the Second World War. Franklin Roosevelt sits down with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud from Saudi Arabia, and they make a kind of a deal. And Franklin Roosevelt says, we can provide you with security, you, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, if you provide us with a stable, affordable, reliable source of oil. And this agreement, made in 1945 aboard a ship in the Suez Canal, is still in place, essentially, even though we're using much, much less oil from the Middle East. But there are many more tales I could tell you about all of this, but of course, one of them is that Franklin Roosevelt puts this promise to the Arab people in writing, in fact, as soon as he gets home from the Suez Canal, and then Franklin Roosevelt dies. Is replaced by Harry Truman, and Harry Truman does not feel compelled to live up to the same agreement with the Saudis on behalf of all Arabs. And so, when the United Nations puts out a plan for partitioning Palestine, Harry Truman tells the Saudis that the United States is going to vote against it, and then the United States votes for it. The Arabs feel betrayed, and we can talk about that in detail. But one of the things that is a huge part of this whole process in the post-World War II era was that the Arabs were squabbling amongst themselves, were divided as all of those groups you saw in Syria were divided, or all of those different groups you saw in Lebanon were divided. The Arabs played their hand badly, and the Jews, they played a weak hand brilliantly. As one headline said, Zionist skill, Palestinian folly. The U.S. ambassador to the, to the new United Nations, our first ambassador, was a Wisconsin, former senator from Wisconsin. The reason he got this job from Harry Truman was that he, Warren Austin, spoke French. And French was the diplomatic language, so he obviously was going to be our UN ambassador. He is famous for two things, three actually. His vote in favor of the partitioning of Palestine, and his quote that he made as part of that process. I'll just let you read it. You can't make this stuff up, really. The other reason he's famous is that he brought a loaded assault rifle into the National Security Council to demonstrate American power, I guess. But the State of Israel is born. What happens, quickly speaking, is that Israel, in fact, gets the whole world behind them to create this territory in Palestine, and the Palestinians don't. That's it in a nutshell. There is almost no international support for the creation of a Palestinian state, but you saw from this slide that there was supposed to be one, right? An Arab state and a Jewish state. But this happened, and this never did to this day. And if you're wondering where Gaza is, it's right there, motoring on. You're going to love those slides when you watch them at home. This is what Palestine used to look like before the creation of the State of Israel. Again, the green parts are Palestinian lands. The white parts, growingly white parts, are Jewish land in 1946. But look how the borders have changed over time. If you're a Palestinian, this is what you see happening, the extraordinary shrinking of your territory to this sort of set of Bantustans, many times disconnected towns and villages on the West Bank and Gaza. This whole part of the world, Israel and Palestine today, are about the same size as Vancouver Island. So not a very large piece of property, but there are 14 million people on it, about 7 times more than there are in Vancouver Island. Palestine looks like this today. The Gaza Strip is 140 square miles. Do you know how many of those, a territory that size, would fit into Whatcom County? 17. There are 2 million people in Gaza, and it's one of the most densely packed parts of the world. And what Palestinians think of when they think of this, there's a comedy team, one Palestinian and one Israeli, that have been going around the world, and one of their routines is they're sitting in a little cafe and there's one piece of pizza left before them, and they're arguing about who should have it. And while they argue, the Israeli is eating it. Huh. Black humor. But far be it from us to be able to be too critical of this. And so why do I have this picture of this structure? What is it? It's a glass house, and we kind of live in it, and we shouldn't throw stones. But we too have a history of expanding our empire, not necessarily caring what happens to the indigenous peoples or the wildlife or the economy or the equality, the ecology of the territory. And we also have a legal history, a history of simply eliminating whole groups of people's inhabitation of certain parts of the United States and pushing them onto reservations. The horribly named but accurately named Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson's administration in the 1830s took tens of thousands of Indians in northern Florida and southern Georgia, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cree, the Seminole, and pushed them out of those territories into Oklahoma. Several thousand of them died along the way. The images from Gaza and from Palestine and from Israel are horrifying. On October 7th of 2023, the images of the kibbutzim in southern Israel being attacked were awful, horrific. The joy at the other end of the spectrum when some of their hostages came home. This is a guy you may not have heard of. Shamsuddin is still living. He is living in Gaza, has been under the bombardment for 15 months now, and he's a producer for PBS NewsHour, and he has heroically been sending out images from Gaza all throughout this war. This is what his house looked like in Gaza before this current war started, and sadly, this is what it looks like now. This is an image that is played all the way across Gaza. 90% of the buildings have been destroyed. But as you've seen probably in your news feed, the Gazans are streaming back into their traditional neighborhoods and towns up even into the north of Gaza. They're not waiting for there to be any kind of a structure that they could live in, and it's really the opposite of trying to create a homeland for them somewhere else on the planet. They really simply want to go home. When you read these slides in the comfort of your own apartment, you'll see all of these figures, but they're sort of horrifyingly stark because there's so much death and destruction on both sides, really, that you'll read about. You'll read about the ceasefire and how it is hopefully being managed, but one of the curious aspects of it right now is that if we can get to the second stage of the ceasefire, a substantial amount of foreign aid is designed to arrive in Gaza, and the majority of that foreign aid was designated to come from, some of you might understand why that is problematic. The third stage gets to the end of the conflict and to the liberation of Gaza and to the removal of all foreign troops and the creation of a development plan for the country. While this very tentative ceasefire agreement is still in place, and fingers crossed it will work for the whole of all three stages, then we have an unfortunate, I think, moment in world diplomacy where President Trump has decided that no, maybe the Gazans shouldn't have, Palestinians shouldn't have Gaza, we'll take it. This has made the right wing of the Israeli government very happy, because their fondest dream is that all of Palestine be cleared of the Palestinian people. Don't forget to read all the books on your reading list. Don't forget to read these three books, which I think are all on your reading list. And what quickly kinds of questions do you have before we have to wrap up? In the back.
The word Palestine, does that come from Philistine?
Yes, it does. And though, if you read Israeli government sources, they say, oh no, those two things don't have anything to do with each other.
I've run into that.
Yep. Yep.
There are no Palestinians.
Yep.
They're just Arabs.
Yeah. One of the people that says there are no Palestinians is Mike Huckabee, who is nominated to be our ambassador to Israel now. Yeah. Okay, yes, ma'am.
How much do you think Trump's plan will affect the ceasefire?
I think Trump's plan is so harebrained that nobody is going to put up with it. But I think somebody, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Gulf states, maybe with Saudi funding, is going to have to come up with an alternative plan for the development of Gaza. But the right wing of Netanyahu's government won't accept anything that leaves the Palestinians in Gaza. They're thinking that this, from the river to the sea, should all be Israel. In the same way that Hamas has said the river to the sea should be all Palestine. So I don't think Trump's proposal was realistic in any universe you can imagine, but it might prompt somebody to come up with a solution that might work. Yeah.
What do you think the United States gets out of its allyship with Israel?
Aha. Why are we so committed to Israel? I think several reasons for that. Historically, we didn't do much for the Jews during World War II. In fact, we turned many of them away when their ships arrived in the United States and said, no, we don't want you to come and to immigrate and to escape from the horrors of Nazi Germany. I think we felt a great deal of guilt after that, after the Second World War, and that led Harry Truman to say, well, let's be supportive of Israel. The United States was the first country to recognize them 11 minutes after they declared their independence. I also think it was right in the middle of the Cold War, and we very much wanted an ally that we could count on in the Middle East that was not a Soviet satellite. Egypt, right next door, was a Soviet satellite in the post-war period. We wanted our own American satellite. And maybe the third thing is that there are about 7 million Jews in the United States who are very supportive and very financially supportive of anything Israel does. The group that's much larger than the Jews in America in support are evangelical Christians who are providing money for more settlements to be built in Palestine. And the reason is that those people are often thought to be something called dispensationalists, and they think that all of Palestine needs to be occupied by the Jewish people before the second coming is possible. So those evangelical groups, there may be as many as 80 million of them in the United States, more than 10 times the number of American Jews, are funneling money into the settlement of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Golan Heights, and maybe in the future Gaza. So for all those reasons, I think we are all in. The Biden administration put very little disincentive behind the provision of all of those munitions to the Israeli government over the last 15 months. I want to leave you with a slightly hopeful feeling in your hearts. Just going to let that soak in for just a second. We should be able to do better than this. But one of the things that we often used in the Middle East, of course, was Aladdin's lamp. And so I was thinking that what we needed were 3 wishes from Aladdin's lamp, and that I want us all to have these 3 wishes. And the first wish is that the Palestinian people figure out a way to develop leadership that has their best interests topmost in mind and in their hearts. That's 1. 2, my wish is that the Israeli people can figure out how to develop leadership that has their best interests topmost in mind and in their hearts. That's 2. And the third wish, I would like to make a similar wish, but apply it closer to home. Thank you very much for having me, Whatcom Community College.